Is the world really heading towards World War III? Some of us already started asking ourselves this question 2 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine, and since then, it seems like the world is trying to convince us more and more that that's the case, while somehow making ourselves more comfortable with the idea. Although, believe me, I know it's nothing comfortable about that, just goosebumps and sweaty terrors at the mere thought of it. Therefore, just to keep ourselves entertained while the world around us is going nuts, we will try to address this question right now and draw some parallel between the landscape of previous two major conflicts and see if or how similar they are with the situations the world is facing today. So, if you are curious about it too, stay tuned while we dive into the world just before World War I. Well, a lot of people romanticize the Victorian era, which happens to be the time period roughly just before the war to end World War started. Life back then was not so glamorous for the vast majority of people anywhere on the globe, and that world would not be so familiar to us if we were to take a time machine and travel there. To give you an idea, if you are watching this video, especially from Europe or North America, you are probably living in more comfort than the creme de la creme of society of that epoch, and have access to better health treatment than the royals had. It was the time when boys as young as 4 years old were still being used as chimney sweeps. The world literacy was at 20%, women were just starting to get treated as actual human beings, and slavery was still pretty common. It was a multipolar world split amongst empires. Empires that can shortly be described as one ethnic group exploiting and profiting on the backs of the other ethnic groups inside its borders. And these empires were hungry to have more and more of those. Therefore, they used to have constant clashes, fighting over trade routes or land grabs in different parts of the world. It's the period of the Second Industrial Revolution that brought with it rapid scientific discovery, standardization, mass production, and industrialization. It coincides with the so-called Belle Epoch, which some historians see as the period when European civilization achieved its greatest power in global politics, and also exerted its maximum influence upon peoples outside Europe. So basically it was Belle for a select few people, but not as Belle for many others, inside or outside Europe. In this landscape, in which a small part of society lived in mesmerizing palaces throwing opulent parties while the vast majority of people were working and living in inhumane conditions, something strong started brewing. Resentment was everywhere to be found in these empires, and radical movements, although not a new concept, were growing in popularity in the lower ends of society. Combine that with a complex network of alliances and the ego the size of Versailles of the emperors in the epoch, and you have the perfect recipe. All that was left was the secret ingredient: the Balkan spirit, which killed the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. And to showcase how one event created a chain reaction that blew up the world entirely, let's see the first days of the First World War. On July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and with that, the network of alliances was triggered. On July 29, Austro-Hungarian forces began to shell the Serbian capital Belgrade, and Russia, Serbia's ally, ordered a troop mobilization against Austria-Hungary. France, allied with Russia, began to mobilize on August 1st. France and Germany declared war against each other on August 3rd. After crossing through neutral Luxembourg, the German army invaded Belgium on the night of August 3 to 4, prompting Great Britain, Belgium's ally, to declare war against Germany. The industrialization and rapid scientific discovery was present in all aspects of life. So alongside canned vegetables and tin cans called cars, you also had mass production for artillery shells and bullets. And this is how the military complex came into existence. An industry that can thrive on something that all nations, except Russia, try to avoid entirely, as they are too costly to sustain. And that is the killing and injuring of people and massive destruction of infrastructure. Or shortly put, war. Anyways, in the aftermath of World War I, who turned Europe into a slaughterhouse in ruin, the countries that won thought it was the war that ended all wars, as it was so destructive and gruesome that certainly the ones who lost it will never dare trying something similar ever again, and the geopolitical map that they drew during the Paris Peace Conference will stay like that forever. But that was not the case, as there were some countries deeply dissatisfied with how things concluded, and that in turn led to the world just before World War II. As the peace agreements were gathering dust, two major countries had a growing resentment towards their conclusion. Germany was utterly humiliated during the peace talks, being forced to accept the responsibility for the war, and lost the following: 13% of its land, 12% of its population, which in total meant around 48% of the country's iron production and a large portion of coal production, had to give up its colonial territories, and paid around 2.4% of its national income from 1919 to 1932 in war reparations, alongside demilitarized zones, a cap on how many soldiers or military hardware they can have, etc. This was the lesson learned for the end of the second conflict to not impose such harsh conditions on a proud, powerful nation. The other culprit was USSR, which although fought alongside the winning powers as the Russian Empire, due to their withdrawal before the war ended, was not considered amongst winning countries and lost the following: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Belarus and Ukraine all became independent, while Bessarabia united with Romania. Russia lost 34% of its population, 54% of its industrial land, 89% of its coal fields and 26% of its railways. In total, around 1 million square miles of territory and around 55 million people, prompting Lenin to call it that abyss of defeat, dismemberment, enslavement and humiliation. It's easy to see why World War I was not nearly close to ending all wars, and after a decade of slow recovery came the 1930s. This was a challenging decade to say the least. It was marked by the financial instability worldwide, which stemmed from the 1929 Wall Street crash, generally known as the Great Depression, and great political instability all around the world. In the USSR, a severe famine in the major grain area production took place from 1930 to 1933 and wiped out around 5 to 8.7 million people. Amongst other factors, that was due to the forced collectivization and persecution of the kulaks and several droughts. In 1932 and 1933, in a polarized German society caused by the effects of the Great Depression that hampered the economic aids to the country, saw the rise of Hitler and his Nazi party, which was supported by business leaders in fear of the communists taking over their business. Shortly after, he ordered the construction of the first Nazi concentration camp and his reign on terror began. In the meantime, Italy waged war against Libya and Ethiopia, while a similar famine to the one in USSR hit China between 1936 to 1938, which killed around 5 million people. In the years to come, Germany annexed Austria, a part of Czechoslovakia, before invading Poland and started the largest conflict in human history. In the aftermath, only two superpowers were left standing, which antagonized each other and split the world in two for almost half a century, in what is conventionally known as the Cold War. The end of this conflict, which was characterized by tense relations between both sides, nuclear proliferation and constant underground fights through proxies, saw a crumbling USSR, mainly due to the failing economic model of the communists, while the USA emerged victorious as the world hegemonic power. Being the top G in town, in the process you make some enemies and put a bullseye target on your back. This prompts why there are lots of parts of the world that are not very happy with the US, with some of them even wanting to share a piece of the pie the US has. With that target on the back came a brutal attack on US soil in what is now widely known as 9/11, which made Americans to call upon Article 5 of its NATO alliance and started its not so popular war on terror. A conflict that arguably created more enemies than friends, destabilized regions and had created direct or indirect around 4.5 to 4.7 million casualties, and ended with a chaotic retreat and a total cost of around $8 trillion. And this brings us to the world today. This will not take us long, as all of us are probably aware of what's going on around the globe, so let's make a short list in order to create some context. The 2020 started with a global pandemic that, needless to say, caught everyone by surprise and resulted in a complete mess. Millions have died, while half of the world population stopped believing in science and vaccines and started believing in stories that make science fiction books pale in comparison. It was also the period in which celebrities became finally relevant for anything else other than what they are famous for, and showed us how our leaders are not as smart as we may have thought. In the same time, in the world hegemony, there were protests after protests, with cities literally on fire and rioters that stormed the Capitol building looking uncomfortably similar to a civil war. Combined with the not so glamorous retreat from the war on terror, prompted Vladimir Putin to think that the US is weak and now is his chance to revive Russia to its former glory and put it at the same table with the big guys. Therefore, in 2021, started amassing troops at the Ukrainian border and launched a full-scale invasion in February 2022. Since then, Russia has consolidated stronger and stronger ties with China and Iran. In the meantime, Xi Jinping was handed an unprecedented third term, prompting him to stay in power for life, and continued his political cleansing strategy and started taking a more aggressive stance against Taiwan. Towards the end of 2023, a full-fledged war between Israel and Hamas erupted in the Middle East, with yet another ground invasion of a neighboring country, creating huge tensions in an area already pretty tense. As the calendars changed and now we moved into 2024, in case we were getting bored, an array of crises erupted in the Red Sea, which disrupted a major trade route. This year is also a super election year, with almost half of the planet going to vote, and the rising tide of extremism can be seen all around the globe, and some political figures that are very eager to ride it. By the way, if you want to hear more about the elections this year, you can check out our video on the topic, link in the description. So, with this general overview of the previous major conflicts and today's landscape, let's now answer the question: are we heading towards World War III? Now, just right off the bat, no one knows, no one can know, and we are just here speculating. Although we may see some similarities between the previous conflicts and today, it's not always necessary that history repeating itself must lead to same results. So now that we know that we don't know, let's draw some parallels. It starts to be clearer and clearer that some sort of axis is forming with Russia, Iran and China, each having their own interest, on one in Europe, the other in the Middle East and the latter in South Asia. Although arguably China doesn't think this small and would like to have influence over as many countries as possible. Can this trigger a world conflict? Yes, there can be multiple scenarios in which that would be the case, one in which the US is drawn into a bigger conflict in the Middle East, or with China in the Pacific and calls upon Article 5, or an attack of Russia in a neighboring NATO country. Although it's not apparent that any of the world leaders today are willing to trigger a war at this scale, because as authoritarian as some of them are, they still need public support for something this big. But mistakes can be made, and one single event can quickly trigger a domino effect, as we saw in World War I. And this is by far the biggest threat since 2022 until today. Is the situation with China, Russia and Iran wanting to have more influence over the world similar to Nazi Germany and the USSR before World War II? Yes and no. In the case of Russia, arguably there can be literally the same territorial claims and desires. However, as similar with Stalin may be, it does not seem that Vladimir Putin can have the same power over Russian people. Mainly because now they have access to way more information and they are not so eager to jump into conflicts, it's not theirs. And we see that with mobilization, which is not so popular among the general public. Other than that, today's world does not resemble the 1930s or the one prior to World War I. A lot of the world population have a good life compared to those in the previous epochs. It would really not be fair for the factory workers who worked and lived in inhumane conditions, or the millions of people starving to death, to compare our situations with theirs. So, to conclude this video, yes, a World War III is a possible scenario, and the number of crises and conflicts around the globe can be a breeding ground for it to happen. I would however say that preventing it is also in our power and responsibility. To not fall to aggressive rhetoric or hatred of our leaders, and to remember that a war is to be avoided at all costs, especially a major one. As long as you remember that no matter where on the globe you are, your race or religion, most of the people on the other side just want to live their lives and prosper just like you do. And that is definitely nicer to visit each other's countries than bomb each other's countries. With that being said, thanks for watching, and if you like this video, give us a thumbs up. And let us hear what are your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe we are heading towards World War III, or do you think it already started?